This is the Bob Unger Show, the Bob Unger Podcast. And today is the 13th of July. And we have a very, very special and honored guest, Dr. Andrew Kaufman, who's been involved in quite a bit of controversy because he dares to actually question the entire medical industrial complex and the coronavirus thought police that don't want to allow people who have degrees and knowledge and expertise to express simply a different opinion. For some reason today, we're no longer allowed to do that, but Dr. Kaufman is a truth seeker. He deserves a lot of credit. Most of you out there do not have the guts to do what he's doing, but it is people like Dr. Kaufman that created America. It wasn't the timid and the sunshine patriot, as Thomas Paine spoke about. So welcome, Dr. Kaufman.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was, you said some very generous things. I really appreciate it.
Well, people who know me know that I say very truthful things. And if I thought the opposite, I would say that as well.
All right, I'll be careful about that.
So, at any rate, give us basically your curriculum vitae very briefly. I know you're not a braggart, and I know you have humility, but just give people, because unfortunately, a lot of people, they look at credentials. So just give your brief curriculum vitae.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I did my undergraduate at MIT and got my degree in biology there. And then I worked for the health department doing AIDS case reporting for a couple of years before I went to school to be a physician assistant. And as a PA, I was a faculty member of the Medical University of South Carolina in the hematology and oncology department and worked with very sick cancer patients for 2 years. Then I went back to medical school in South Carolina and did my residency in psychiatry at Duke, and then did a fellowship in forensic psychiatry at Upstate Medical University. After that, I joined the faculty there and was assistant professor for several years. I was in some leadership positions. I also started a medical device company and got a patent on that device. And then also did expert witness type work. And after several years on faculty, went off on my own and did all of those things as a private practice. Until just recently, when I was terminated from my last regular psychiatric contract due to refusing to wear a mask.
And why did you refuse to wear a mask, since that's the elephant in the room right now with Cuomo, the emperor, telling us that he's the law and we have to wear a mask? So why is it that you oppose masks?
Well, first was just a very practical reason, because I was working as a psychiatrist with teenagers and they're telling me very personal information about their traumas and really difficult times, or tell me about suicide attempts, very sensitive type information. And, you need to relate to someone at a very personal level in order to create safety for that kind of communication, and so that they know that you're taking them seriously and that you show empathy for their situation. And without, with a mask on, you can't really establish that rapport with someone, because it's covering up your facial expressions. And, there are so many psychological factors associated with this, but, covering your face is associated with shame. And you don't want to create a situation where someone's experiencing a lot of shame because of their past, that you intensify it in that way. So that was the, one main reason that applied specifically to my job. But in addition to that, there's actually no evidence that masks prevent any disease. And without even getting into questioning about contagion and viruses causing the disease, they've done several randomized controlled trials with different types of masks, and not one of those studies has showed a benefit. So aside from there being no benefit of wearing a mask in terms of preventing disease, there's also many studies that show that it actually causes health problems. Like it lowers your oxygen levels, and many people to the point where if they were in a hospital, they would be given supplemental oxygen. So, all these people walking around with masks, many of them should have oxygen tanks because they're basically depriving themselves of oxygen. And then there are several other health effects. And then, of course, just the general psychological effects. I mean, how can you relate to people, in any way, personally, professionally, socially, through the barrier of a mask. So it was something I was not willing to do because there was not one upside for it and many, many downsides.
My view, and you can react to it, is that they want to instill fear in the population, and they want to get people used to control. And that's what, to me, as a non-scientist, I'm only a lawyer, so I'm not as qualified as you are on this subject, but how would you react to my statement?
Yeah, well, I think actually fear is the main mechanism that has been used to manipulate the people into going along with all sorts of things that don't make sense. Certainly the masks. I mean, it's just kind of actually astonishing to me why people would go around wearing masks all the time, even when they're alone. They're not near any other people or they're driving in their car. Like you couldn't, even if you believe that there was some airborne thing that you could get if you come close to a sick person, there's absolutely no possibility of that in those situations. So people are, interpreting this in irrational ways, which tells me that it's driven by emotion. And, when they declared a pandemic status back at the end of March, I think that set off a, epidemic of fear across the country. And people were so afraid of dying that they were willing to go along with all sorts of things, like basically giving up their First Amendment freedoms, right? Like their freedom of assembly, their freedom of travel, when they were locked down in their homes. And of course, all of the businesses that were shut down, everyone went along with this and out of fear, because there was, as better than I do, right? Because this is your area of expertise. I'm not aware of even one law that's been passed in any state that requires participation or compliance in any of these, measures that in the media they portray as being mandatory or required by law. So fear is the way that people have been manipulated into giving up control to an authority figure and, giving up their basic rights. And this fear, when someone is in such a fate of fear where they're basically worried about survival, then what happens is they're really only able to consider things that directly impact their survival. They can't take a step back and look at the bigger picture and consider that perhaps the government has a different agenda and that they're not basing these policies on, matters related to your health, but on some other matters.
Yeah, from watching some prior interviews you've done, it is your basic premise, at least the way I understand it with my limited knowledge, it's your premise that the proper scientific procedures to identify a so-called virus, in this case, what they call COVID-19, has not been effectuated, and therefore you cannot say definitively that there's any such thing as a COVID-19 virus. And most people, and I'm trying to think like most people and not like a doctor, most people will say, well, then how come all these people are sick? And I know this one who's sick and that one who's sick, and they have atrial fib, or they lost their legs, like that soap opera, I think it was a soap opera actor, some kind of actor, who died, and he had an amputation and all these complications. And how could this be happening? And how would you respond to that?
Well, it's kind of a complicated question, but I think, there's really two separate things to think about there. One is, is there evidence of a new disease? And then secondly, if there was a spike in excess deaths, what was the cause of it? So, and I think it's really important to look at those two things separately, because if there is not a new disease that could be characterized, then we know that that couldn't be the cause of those deaths. So if you just think about it, like how is it determined when a new disease arises? Okay, so the typical thing is that there would be a set of symptoms that would be consistent, and that's how you could label people as having that illness by their symptoms. There may also be a set of specific pathological findings at autopsy, right? Like, for example, in a heart attack, when you autopsy the person and you examine the heart, you see that there is a blockage of the blood flow and there's dead heart muscle, right? So that you then understand what a heart attack is, because you can find that dead heart muscle and you know what the symptoms are. So then that becomes characterized as a new disease. So with this COVID-19, and COVID-19, by the way, is the name of the illness, not the virus. The virus has a different name, which I'll say in a second. They, said that there were some respiratory symptoms originally that were pretty non-specific, right? Like a dry cough and fever and maybe shortness of breath, right? But those symptoms occur in many diseases that we already know about. So there's nothing particularly novel or new about that. But over time, we see that they've attributed now many, many different symptoms to it, right? Like I've seen nausea and vomiting, muscle aches, blood clots, all skin rashes, right? All these kinds of symptoms that at first they didn't talk about at all. So it seems like it's a bit all over the map. There's not a clear set of symptoms that defines this illness. And then secondly, you have, well, if there is a distinct set of symptoms defining this illness, then what's the cause? Now, at the very beginning, when there were just a handful of people sick in Wuhan, China, for those handful of people, they gave them some antibiotics, like to see if it was just regular pneumonia, and they didn't get better. And then they pretty much just assumed it was a virus. They didn't look for other causes, or they didn't say to themselves, well, could this just be the flu? Or could this be, colds? They didn't do autopsies to characterize those bodies' illnesses at all. But instead, they did these experiments trying to look for a virus. And as you mentioned before, they didn't follow the proper procedure to identify a virus as laid out by the scientists of germ theory, who put forth a set of rules. This is how you identify a germ, including a virus, a bacteria that causes an illness. And this is how you prove it causes the illness. And it's very straightforward how to prove that.
Is that what they call Koch's or Koch's postulates?
Yeah, yes, Koch's postulates, exactly right. And I'll get to that in a minute. But if you don't look at any of this scientifically, it's difficult to look at these papers and read through the method section of how they actually conducted these experiments and to see other experiments where they tried to prove Koch's postulates. But if you just go to the conclusion section of any of these articles where they claim to isolate a new coronavirus and they say it's associated with COVID-19. By the way, they call this alleged virus that they say they've identified is SARS-CoV-2. Okay, and that's related to the SARS outbreak in 2003. They call that virus SARS-CoV-1. And they say these two things are related. So if you look at the conclusion sections of those papers, you won't find one paper that says, as a result of our experiments, we've proven that this virus causes this illness. So not one scientist has made that claim based on their own scientific study. Now you can see, if you look in the scientific papers, that suddenly in the introductory sections of the paper, it makes that statement that this virus has been shown to cause this disease. But there's not one reference that you can find where that has actually been proven. So in other words, they just made it up. And then they carried it forward in all these papers in the introductory sections. It's never in the conclusion section of a paper because there's no scientific experiment that proved it. So it's just something that was fraudulently stated. And that's the basis of all of these policies, because they're all around that we're preventing the spread of a virus, whereas there's not one experiment that's been done where the scientists stated that they've shown a virus causes this new disease.
Is there actually a disease, or is it just your typical diseases that people get, such as the flu, pneumonia, bronchitis, or is this something distinct which they haven't defined?
Yeah, well, I don't see really any evidence of anything distinct aside from a couple of anecdotes that it's hard to say what they mean because they only involve a small number of people. But overall, there's not anything worldwide that has declared itself as specific enough that I would say there's a new disease. And in fact, so if you look at the number of people who died, and I think that's really the only thing of value to look at, because the number of cases that they're reporting now is just based on having a positive test result. But even the FDA and the CDC say that these tests can't be used to make a diagnosis, that they're basically experimental for research purposes only. None of the tests have been approved by the FDA. They've only received emergency use authorization, which basically means that they don't have to prove that the test works in order to use it. They just have to show some basic standard that it's like repeatable or something like that. So, so since there's no tests that are accurate at all, the only thing you can really look at would be like autopsies and deaths. Now, through policy, which is like normally, Bob, when you have like a public health emergency, right, which was declared by every state in the United States, the procedure would be any person who died of or was suspected to die of that health crisis, they would automatically be sent for an autopsy to the medical examiner, because that's how you would determine what is going on. In the case of this situation we're in now, they did the opposite. They prohibited people from sending bodies for autopsies. Instead, they just instructed to put COVID-19 on the death certificates. So this made it look way, like super inflated compared to reality. And then we don't have the autopsies to show that what these people actually died from. And I believe that not doing the autopsies was to cover up that none of these people are dying of some new illness, that they're either dying of an existing illness like they always would have died from, or they're basically being killed by medical procedures. And
there's intubation, ventilators, and drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can go into this in a bit of detail, but if you just look at the overall mortality spike, it was a pretty short spike from about the beginning of April, end of March until the middle of May, much shorter than an average flu season. And you could see that the deaths went up really, really fast at the beginning and then came down just as fast. And what I think happened is that suddenly because this occurred right after the announcement that it was a pandemic by the World Health Organization, and right after that happened is when all the states started instituting lockdown procedures and started really flooding the airwaves with fear-mongering about this pandemic. And as a result of those policies, what you had is that hospitals basically shut down almost all of their beds and only kept beds open for COVID-related illness. So if you were, a diabetic, for example, and you had a complication, you wouldn't necessarily even have access to the hospital, or you might be so scared to go to the hospital because you would get COVID because there's only COVID people at the hospital. And then all of these outpatient doctors' offices began shutting down. And all these people suddenly had no access to healthcare. So people that would maybe normally go to the ER, like they have chest pain or shortness of breath, they were not going there. And I think many of these people were dying at home as a result of that. So that's one thing. Then the people who needed urgent medical care that didn't get it, I think many of them died as a result of that. And I'll give you what I think is the biggest example, which is with diabetes, because the government does not keep track of how many people die of diabetes medications. But if you go and ask any ambulance driver, how often do you see someone who's overdone their diabetes medicine and their blood sugars bottomed out too low, they'll say practically every shift. And you can find a study that says between 1% and 2% of all emergency department visits in the entire country are because the blood sugar is too low from diabetes medications. So when you have this sudden lockdown and you have change in the way people have access to food at the same time and access to healthcare, I think what happened is many people changed their diet. They're taking insulin and other blood sugar lowering diabetes medicines, and they now have very limited access to their doctor and to the hospital and emergency services. So I think many people actually simply died of low blood sugar from, the medications, from accidents with those medications, because they're so difficult to maintain without that happening. So I think there are a lot of medical issues like that that cause people to die very quickly. If you look at like some of the numbers of the cause of death, you'll see that some very common causes of death, like heart attacks and heart disease, for example, this year during that time, it dropped down to by 2/3, right? And there was nothing going on that would suddenly, prevent 2/3 of heart attack deaths in conjunction with this pandemic, when you have actually now suddenly no or very minimal access to healthcare at all. So, the explanation for that is that they simply relabeled those heart attack deaths as COVID deaths.
The average person, I'm trying to think like the average person would say, number one, why would they lie about something like this? And number two, are they lying or are they just stupid and incompetent?
Well, Bob, you got to ask who's lying and who's saying what. So, because there's a lot of lying going on, and you can catch them in these lies. So, like, for example, Dr. Fauci, he wrote an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine in I think it was March 26th. And he wrote there that this pandemic is the same as a seasonal flu with a 0.1% mortality. Now, why would he, say that in one place, which is, when we have the seasonal flu every year, we don't lock down the place. We don't shut down every small business. We don't wear masks. We don't, do any of these things for a flu. So if this is the same as a flu, why are we doing all these things? So he says that in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is only going to be read by other doctors. It's not going to be read by the general population. And then a few days after that, he goes on a press conference and says that we need to extend lockdown measures, right? So he's telling two different audiences two different things. He also was caught lying about the masks, where early on he said that masks were not going to be helpful. And that was the truth, because that's what the scientific studies say. But he changed his mind later on, and then he made up, some excuse about why he lied. But you can catch these people lying, all the time, left and right. And then you want to look at just what are the procedures that they're doing. So when they say, let's not do autopsies and let's not find out what's killing these people, like, you have to ask yourself, why would they make that policy? Like, those policies of how you handle a public health crisis, those are well thought out, well planned out by, tons of experts. That's why they're on the books that way. So why would they suddenly on the fly reverse those policies in a real situation? That doesn't make any sense. You got to look on the actual websites of what they say, like the CDC website and the FDA website both say that the tests should not be used for diagnostic purposes, yet that's how they're being used. So there's all these contradictions, and you don't have to rely on any controversial news sources to see these contradictions. They're right on the government websites. What you see is that the media is not really reporting what the government agencies are saying there. They're instead putting some kind of spin on it, or they're just omitting things. Like, I never heard any mainstream media talk about the inaccuracy of the diagnostic testing. But it's right there. You can download the documents right from the FDA, and it says right in there, not accurate for diagnosis. Even on the label that comes with the testing kit, it says for research purposes only.
That's amazing. What is the percentage accuracy of this so-called test?
Well, it's 0% accurate, because it has not been tested against any gold standard. Like, when you make a new diagnostic test, you have to compare it to something that is accurate and 100% accurate if possible, and they call that the gold standard. So for example, let's say I want to test a new pregnancy test, right? I have a pregnancy test that if you put a swab on your tongue, it turns green if you're pregnant. Okay. So I would find a group of women and I would do that test on them, and then I would wait 9 months and I would see how many of those women a baby came out of. And if a baby came out of them, they were pregnant, right? That's the gold standard. The actual baby came out. And then you could say, well, how many of the ones that gave birth to a baby had a green, swab? And how many of the ones that didn't have a baby had a green swab? And then you can calculate an error rate based on that experiment. It's very simple, very straightforward. For the test for COVID, which, by the way, doesn't even test for a virus because they've never actually purified a virus out of anybody with this illness, it tests a short sequence of genetic material or a test for an antibody, depending on which test. The test that takes a couple of days to get back is for the genetic material. And the test that you get the answer back in an hour or less is the antibody test. But neither of those things test for the virus, and they've never been compared to testing for the virus directly. So they have no known error rate, and we don't even know what they test for because they didn't, find a purified virus particle in anybody and then correlate it to this genetic material. They just found this genetic material in somebody's lung fluid that had thousands of different sources of genetic material.
And yet you have all these crooked politicians, which is generally a redundant phrase, constantly saying we've got to test. Everything's test. In fact, you probably saw on the sports section of the paper that all of these famous New York Yankees are testing positive for the virus. And from what I understand, they're asymptomatic. They're not sick. So how do you explain this?
Well, like I said, we don't know what this test is actually testing for. So it could be positive in anybody. And I bet if we, what you're basically doing is just taking a sample of the population and giving them tests, and then a certain percentage is going to be positive no matter what. Like they've done study with this test. I think this was done in Italy, where they gave people these were people who were ill in the hospital with something, and they would be negative one day. They would test them every single day. So they'd have a negative result one day, a positive result the next day, and then a negative result the next day. So you can see that it had nothing, they were sick all 3 days, right? But their test result kept changing because it's not testing for any illness. We don't know what it's testing for, to be honest with you. We really have no idea because we have not found the origin of that RNA that the test is for. And with the antibody tests, they haven't published any studies or data about it. They've only submitted some preliminary data to the FDA, which is protected now, until the Freedom of Information Act would be applicable. So you can't even look at what the antibody is. You have no idea what it is, even how it was developed.
My wife, who's a PhD, wrote down a few questions for someone like me who's scientifically ignorant. So I'm going to ask you some of these questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
First thing she brought up was you have said previously that they never isolated a virus. If that's the case, what is responsible for the measles, the mumps, and the flu?
Right. You say never isolated any virus that causes an illness?
I don't know if that's what you said, but I think we thought you said that.
Yeah, well, I haven't found any scientific papers that prove the existence of a virus for any of those illnesses. In the measles one is the most interesting because there's a fairly famous virologist named Stefan Lanka. So he's a PhD scientist and he's German. And during his graduate work, he actually discovered a virus the right way from sea algae. And he did this by basically taking the sea algae cells and filtering them to separate smaller things from the algae cells. And then he did centrifugation a couple of different protocols to basically separate out what was left in that filtered liquid. And then he was able to get a purified mixture of those virus particles and characterize them chemically and sequence the genetic material and showed that this new virus existed. Interestingly, by the way, he found evidence that that virus actually helped the C. algae cells survive rather than causing them illness. But after he achieved that and he was embarking on his career as a scientist, an independent scientist, he wanted to devote his studies to human viruses because he thought he could help people. And then when he started to look at papers, he was unable to find any papers where they actually showed a virus being isolated and purified. So he kept looking more and more and was pretty upset about it and eventually issued this public challenge that for $100,000, that if anyone can show a scientific paper that proves the existence of the measles virus, that he would pay them $100,000. And so there was one, I think it might have been a doctor even, who was very zealous about this and submitted several papers rather than one paper. The challenge was asking for one paper, but he submitted several papers and said that this proves it. And so Dr. Lanka said, no, it doesn't prove it. It doesn't meet my criteria. And this gentleman was very upset and sued him in court. So in the lower court, they didn't really allow Dr. Lanka to present his case. So it had to get appealed up to the German Supreme Court. But the German Supreme Court actually ruled in his favor that there is no paper that proves the existence of measles. So in other words, it's been determined by the German Supreme Court before I even looked at this that there's no virus that causes measles. That's been identified.
And I can just picture a chorus now saying to you, did the polio vaccine cure polio?
Yeah, absolutely not. So polio, you'd have to do some research on your own to really see these things because it's not simple. And if you look at a standard textbook, it would say that the polio vaccine cured polio. In fact, that's the one vaccine that's always held up as the shining example because polio is a really scary disease. I mean, we're talking about children being paralyzed, right? And sometimes died from not being able to breathe. So it's very serious. But if you look at the historical record and look at the scientific record and do some of your own research and check out some excellent books that have done this, opened up this pathway, you'll see that polio was caused principally by insecticides that suddenly became used in a widespread manner without any safety testing. And the seasonal pattern matched exactly what the children were experiencing. And I'm talking about lead arsenate, and then later on DDT, once that was put into widespread use as an alternative. And you could see that the symptoms even shifted when this transition of different toxic agents was made. But essentially, once those things stopped being used in such a widespread manner is when the number of polio cases went down. And
how about hygiene and technology?
How about what?
Hygiene and technology.
Yeah, well, many of the other childhood illnesses that were more common, in the end of the 19th century decreased because of hygiene and sanitation. Absolutely.
I have read that FDR. I read that FDR, because he lived on the Hudson River, as a boy used to go swimming in that river all the time. And of course, at that time, there was all kinds of fecal matter and sewage that were running in those rivers because they didn't have the cleaning technology that we have today. Could that have been a factor?
A factor in well, no, I don't think in polio, because polio is not caused by sewage. Actually, when you have sewage in the water supply and that the supply may be used for drinking, that's typically what leads to cholera, because the bacteria that is associated with cholera lives on the sewage and would basically make a toxin that would cause diarrhea. So people drinking that water would consume that toxin. And that's a really interesting one to look at because that's a bacteria. And even today, it's taught in medical school as the bacteria invades your body and causes illness. But there was a famous microbiology professor in the late 1800s that used to actually swallow a pure culture of that bacteria in front of his class to prove that the bacteria didn't cause the illness. It was the toxin from when the bacteria grows on the sewage. And so he would drink the bacteria for cholera right in front of his class and would never get sick. And we don't have professors doing things like that these days as much, but that definitely proves a point.
My wife had asked, how is a vaccine made if a virus has never been isolated?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And, there's actually no evidence that vaccines have prevented any diseases. So like all of the classic ones that you mentioned, right, like things like whooping cough and diphtheria and tetanus, those things went away before a vaccine was available for widespread use. And then the newer vaccines, they've never been tested in any randomized controlled trials where they would show that, okay, the kids who got the vaccine didn't get this illness and the kids who got a saltwater shot did get this illness. Like those studies have never, ever been done. The way that they approve new vaccines is they just show that the vaccine makes it, that after you get a vaccine that you make an antibody. And I think this is actually quite ironic because they always said to us in medicine that if you have an antibody, it means that you're immune to an illness, right? So you can't get it again. But once the HIV or the AIDS epidemic started and Bob Gallo developed the HIV test, which is an antibody test, then suddenly the meaning changed. And if you have an antibody now, it means that you're sick. So like the quick tests for COVID, right? Those are also antibody tests. So why does that test, which shows an antibody, say that you have an illness, whereas the antibody that gets a vaccine approved says that you don't have an illness?
Interesting.
Right? It is very interesting.
My wife also asked that it's claimed that the coronavirus is an RNA virus. Can you explain in simple terms what DNA is and RNA's relationship to DNA?
Yeah, absolutely. So people probably be most familiar with DNA, right, which is our genetic material. And it's made up of 4 building blocks known as bases. And those could be in any combination and they're built up into a long chain. And there's actually 2 chains. So there's each base has like its complement. And so it'll match up with the other chain to its complement. And there'll be these 2 complementary strands of base, they call them base pairs. And they wind up into that double helix shape that most people are familiar with. And they store all of the genetic material that's in the cells, right? In our cells, in other cells. And you get half of that DNA from your mom and the other half from your dad. And then there's also some DNA in the mitochondria, which is separate, and that you get from your mom. And then the way that you use this, you get the information out of this DNA, or one of the main ways is that you use it to make proteins, because that code partly codes for proteins. It codes for other things too, but that's like the biggest information. And proteins are the type of molecules in our body that are the workforce. Like they are the ones that do all the functions mostly. And so what happens is that double helix partially unwinds when a special enzyme comes in contact with it. And it separates those 2 strands so that the code on the strand could be read. And it's made into an RNA molecule. And RNA also has 4 bases, but it's just 1 strand. And it then leaves the nucleus and goes into another part of the cell to get ready to make a protein. And so the RNA codes for the protein, and it has some things that stick onto it that start building the protein, and it brings amino acids to it to construct new proteins. And so the overall like kind of dogma of biology as it was described to me is like DNA to RNA to protein. Now, RNA can also go backwards and form DNA. It doesn't just go to protein. So, and that was kind of discovered later. And it was originally thought to be only in viruses, a special kind of viruses called retroviruses. But later on, it was found that actually all of our cells can do that backwards reaction. It's called reverse transcription. And it's thought to be mostly used to repair DNA, because when our DNA makes copies of itself, there could be errors. Those are called mutations. And so the reverse transcription can be used to help repair some of those errors, okay? And this happens all the time, right? It's just like, think about it, we go through life, we make little mistakes and we correct them, and the same thing with our, all the molecules in our body make little mistakes too that need to be corrected. So when they say that this virus is an RNA virus, what they mean is that this theoretical model of the virus is that it's a very tiny particle that just has a membrane of some sort, and inside the membrane there's some genetic material, a very short piece compared to like a human cell, and there's some of them contain DNA and some of them contain RNA. And in fact, it's more than that, because there are ones that contain single-stranded DNA versus double-stranded DNA. There are ones that contain mitochondrial DNA, ones that contain RNA. So and there's different kinds of RNAs too. So, but just to see that there's some complexity to that, there's a whole bunch of different particles, and they contain different types of genetic molecules.
Okay, my wife had another question. She says, in previous studies, it was stated that Koch's postulates was satisfied because mice were injected with the virus and developed symptoms. Can you explain your objection to their scientific claims? And then she wrote to me, note to you, Bob, they never injected a control group with saline. The effects that they saw in mice could be the result of the stress caused by the injection.
Yeah. So I think she answered it like, I think I did briefly see that particular paper. There was another paper in 2003 that claimed that the SARS virus had satisfied Koch's postulates. And I did a whole presentation debunking that because it was completely fraudulent. They actually didn't show that any of the criteria were satisfied. So, but I think the biggest question, so aside from like, yes, did they use like standard experimental procedures, like having a control group? And that's one of the biggest criticisms that I have with how these experiments, is that they do not use a control group. But aside from that, with this study that she's mentioning, you would have to say, well, what did they inject into the mice? Because there's not one paper where they've actually isolated and purified a viral particle. And in order to show that this viral particle causes a disease, you'd have to first purify it, and then you would have to put it in a healthy host to see if it causes, and it has to cause the same disease, by the way. So the experiment would go like this, just like Dr. Lanka purified that viral particle out of the sea algae. You have someone who's sick, you purify the viral particle out of it, and by the way, you should be able to purify it out of everyone who has this illness, not just one person. So there needs to be like 100 people that you purify it out of, let's say, because that's not even a big sample size, to be honest with you, but it's pretty reasonable. So you pull it out of 100 people, and then each one you put in healthy hosts. And those hosts should get the same exact symptoms that the disease supposedly causes, and then that will prove that it causes the disease. You're supposed to, the last step, by the way, is you're supposed to then be able to isolate and purify that viral particle out of that host that you made sick, so that you can show that it was still there and it caused the illness.
The mayor of the area in which I live is an obstetrician, and every day he's putting out social distance, put on your masks, don't have a party, don't do this, don't go to the synagogue, don't pray, and just constantly putting out this fear. Now, I don't think that he in particular is a malicious guy. I think a lot of the people at the top are malicious people. But him, I look at him as, what Stalin said about a lot of leftists, that they were very useful for an agenda. And that gets me to a question about, and this is not science, this is simply your postulate about why they're doing it. That's what I'm driving at. Why are they doing this?
Well, my opinion is that this is related to the UN Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 plan. So, and some of the evidence that made me become aware of this was firstly that if you look at how the policies were coordinated with all the governments around the world, that everyone did the same exact thing, and that is very uncharacteristic of how sovereign governments work. Right? They would all make their own decision about how to handle a crisis. But in this case, every country had the same exact policies in a lockstep type of manner. And lockstep actually happens to be the name of a chapter in a document from the Rockefeller Foundation from 2010, where they describe a scenario that almost exactly matches this current situation.
You're talking about lockstep?
Yeah. Yes, lockstep from the Rockefeller Foundation. But so you see this massive coordination on a global scale of practically every government in the world, with very few taking a different approach, taking the same exact policies for a situation when there's not even clear scientific evidence related to it all. Okay, and you didn't even have any signs of excess mortality during the first couple of months of this situation. And even in the United States, where there was excess mortality, if you look at it closely, one thing is it wasn't enough mortality to be statistically significant from prior years. Okay, so in other words, like every year, there's variation in the amount of people who die. So this year, the amount of people who died, it was a little bit more than the average of the last 3 years, but it was not statistically different from those years, because every year it could go up a little, go down a little. And it's not out of that range of the normal variation. So once again, it's not even evidence of excessive death, but it was, because you look at it and it was such a narrow spike over such a short period of time that this happened, as a result of some of the things that we talked about before. But, it happened like that practically everywhere. And so you have all these policies, and then the policies don't match the situation on the ground at all. I mean, not one bit. They compare this to like the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, but in that situation, there were real deaths. I mean, everyone was seeing people around them dying, dropping dead. They were burying bodies in the backyard, right? But obviously, there's been nothing even close to that. In fact, still in my personal life, I don't know of one person who was sick with anything suspicious or who died, not one person at all. And I have a pretty large circle of people I know, right? So there's just this huge disparity between the policy, and then you have policies that don't even make any sense, like shutting down all businesses, right? Now, if you say that it's so contagious that people can't be around each other, then you would shut down every single business, and people could survive just by getting deliveries, right? But instead, what happened is that you're only shutting down small businesses, independent businesses. All of the big box stores were allowed to remain open, right? So that doesn't make sense in terms of contagiousness. It must fit some other agenda. So all of these little pieces of the pie, right, about like the economic policies, the closing of the businesses, changing the hospital policies, the coordination of all the governments, I find that to be pretty conclusive evidence that there's a major other purpose, and that this is coordinated at a very, very high level above the level of the government, right? And that's why I think the World Health Organization, which is affiliated with the United Nations, has played such a central role in terms of leading the policies. But if you look at the document presentation about Agenda 21 and Agenda 30, you'll see that all of these changes fit right in with those plans. And I think that this is basically an opportunity, right? Like there are many, I forget who first said it, but it was a politician, never waste a good crisis, because that's an opportunity to make broad sweeping changes in policy. And I think that this crisis, I feel, has been completely manufactured in order to create a situation where policies could be instituted. So in other words, a problem, reaction, solution type of scenario where the problem is an imaginary virus causing a scary disease. The reaction is fear. And the solution is to clamp down on society and take away the rights.
Well, we've got to wind things down now. It's a shame that I'm not president of the United States, which I doubt with the type of society we have today, that could ever happen. But if I were, I would I would get that hook they used to have in show business and take Fauci off the stage and put you there. But the likelihood of that, I wouldn't bet on. But I really cannot overstate my admiration for you, your courage, your integrity, your character, and your willingness to go out there and be in the arena. That's actually a famous speech by Teddy Roosevelt, the man in the arena. And unfortunately, there's very few people like that. There was a fellow that I interviewed, a black man named Jesse Lee Peterson. And he's pretty infamous because he opposes the whole BLM agenda. But he made one very interesting point that I think relates to you. He said, black people are on the wrong page in terms of their viewpoint about systemic racism and all that. He said, however, they are willing to go out there into the arena and stand up for the viewpoint, no matter how warped you can argue it is. He said, you white people, all you care about is your material things and your money, and you don't have the character to put that at risk. And so you would be the antithesis of the person he was describing. And for that, you deserve our gratitude and our admiration. And I hope to be in touch with you in the future, and God bless you.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. We're in an unprecedented situation in the course of our lifetimes. And if we don't take action now, what's it going to be like for our children?
Well, I gave a speech a while back at one of the universities. The professor was very sorry he invited me. And I ended the speech by telling the kids at the university, so go, now that you know what's coming, go home and smack your parents in the face for what they've allowed to happen. And my dad said that all the time. He said, it's our fault. And that was back in the 60s, let alone today. He said, we've allowed this to happen. And once again, everyone cares about their creature comforts. They care about pleasure. And nobody cares, as Thomas Jefferson spoke about, their posterity. And one day, I believe, it's just my personal opinion, we're going to stand in judgment before God. And he's going to ask us what we stood for and what we did. He's not going to ask us what type of German car we were driving. And so I think you'll be in good stead, and the gates, as they say, will be open to you. So God bless you. God bless you and yours. And let's stay in touch.
All right. Thank you, Bob. I'd appreciate that.
Okay. You take care.